So this is me. I'm Joe Kaplan. Thank you all for coming. So I don't know how if any of you know me, but maybe a few of you, especially my coworkers who were kind enough to show up and cheer me on here today. So yeah, I'm a IT guy from the local area. I work at Accenture, and so possibly a little bit different from the people who do the consulting work and the product work and whatnot. But I've been doing identity and access management for a pretty good long time. I've been working at this for like 25 years or so. And I've spent my entire year at Accenture, which probably sounds like a crazy, crazy thing. So in the, I actually come from a development background. I wrote this book years ago, which maybe some of you may have bought or maybe not, I don't know. It's still out there. You can still get it on Amazon. I'm not really very interested in LDAP programming anymore. I know that there's some people in the room who still do, and I do still. Yeah, and I use your tools, and I love your tools, and I do find I have LDP running on my machine all the time because I can't stop looking at that stupid thing. But I'm kind of a cloud guy for the most part these days, and I do Graph API queries too, and I'm actually trying to improve my skills there. So we have this haiku theme with HIP, and so sprinkled throughout my presentation as well are a few conditional access oriented haikus. I challenge you to spot them. They are not necessarily part of the thing. They're just meant to entertain you, but you can do whatever sort of haiku dance you want if you see them, and we'll just kind of keep moving on. All right, so we're going to talk about conditional access. I call this a conditional access deep dive. Now, what kind of a deep dive are you really going to get in an hour? It's not that deep. But what we're going to try and do is actually give you like a good general overview of how conditional access works in the first piece. And then I am actually going to do a slightly deeper and much more nerdy talk about device-based conditional access, which is the piece that I think is the coolest, is the most interesting. It has the most complicated and weird plumbing, and try and give you some more stuff around that. So that's kind of our overall journey here. A quick show of hands. So conditional access users, who's in Azure and who's using conditional access now? Does anyone know anything about this topic? Yeah, you're a GA and you do this all the time. You don't count. But any much familiarity at all? So if this is all new, that's great. Then you guys may actually learn something. That'll be cool. In any event, so this is my only fancy slide. You will be able to tell that I did not do this because when I actually copied this slide from a Microsoft deck from Ignite, I didn't even know it had a build in it. And I'm so bad at PowerPoint that I didn't even know how to turn it off. But this is their beautiful slide that actually explains conditional access. We're not going to drain all of this, and we're not going to get to every different piece of it, but it is a pretty amazing and elegant system for doing authorization in the cloud. And I'm going to take you through a slightly different version of what it's all about. But let us, whoops, skip the slide. First thing I want to do, though, is talk about licensing. So hopefully we at least have a bunch of O365 customers in here, and people know a little bit about Azure and enterprise licensing and whatnot. So the main thing that you need to know is that to get conditional access, you have to have Azure AD P1. That's kind of like your minimum bar to entry. And so you can get that through P1 or EMS E3. And generally speaking, Microsoft is expecting you to buy this for all of your users. It's what they call full tenant licensing. So buying one P1 license is generally not what they're expecting you to do, even though it will light the feature up. And so there are some features that go with some of the pieces, like Intune, ZMS, E3 or 5, multi-factor auth is P1. And the custom controls feature used to be P2, it's down to P1, so actually something got cheaper. Risk-based auth is the P2 feature in this. And we'll talk about that a little bit, but the bottom line is that this is part of the premium suite for Azure Active Directory. Okay, and I'm not going to attempt to explain Microsoft licensing any more than that, other than it's something you'll have to talk with your account reps about. Okay, moving on. So let's talk about some basic concepts around what is conditional access all about. So this is an authorization platform for protecting your cloud applications. And cloud applications can mean a lot of things, and we'll talk about that a little bit more later. But here are a couple of examples, and I use Accenture examples. All my screenshots are from our actual real policies. You'll see all that in a second. Anjana will see that, and she will laugh, because she probably created some of them. But so, like for example, a conditional access concept might be when Accenture employees are trying to access anything in Azure, they must perform multi-factor authentication. And this is an actual policy that we have, and I will actually even show it to you. But this is something that we want to do. So for anything that we have that's an application managed by Azure, we want everyone to use MFA. MFA all-in is what we call this. And this is something that you would do with conditional access, okay? We also can do some other funkier things, like when specific users are accessing a specific application, they must use a domain-joined Windows PC. And this might be in addition to requiring MFA. So this is like, I'm going to MFA you, but I'm also going to constrain you to using only this device to do this. And so it's a really rich and interesting platform, allows you to do a bunch of different kinds of stuff. These are the kinds of things that you're doing with it. This is based on this concept of condition statement and controls. If this, then allow this. Okay, good so far? Good?
I guess BYOD hasn't come to Accenture yet?
No, actually, I would say that we were probably the original BYO company. We put all of our apps on the internet before it was cool. And one of the things that I will say is that that's been incredibly liberating for us as a company. I think it allowed us to move into modern authentication and single sign-on a lot earlier than a lot of other people did. What we've actually been able to do with this technology is claw back some stuff. Like we had our SAP environment on the public internet. You could log into the web-based portal, and it required multi-factor authentication. But guess what? Maybe SAP isn't something that we want people accessing with their home machines. And now I can actually enforce that if I want. And I can say, you actually really need to use your domain join compliant device for this app. And so it's actually allowed us to keep our ecosystem being very public facing and looking like just like a giant pile of SaaS applications, and make interesting policy decisions based on individual applications. So yeah, we're actually still pretty BYO, but we're reeling it back a little bit. Okay, anatomy of a policy. So this is our default Azure MFA policy that we're looking at here. There's 3 things, so we're going to actually talk about this stuff. So we have targeting, like what the policy applies to, the conditions that we're applying in this policy, and then the controls that are going to be implemented on top of the policy. Okay? Those are your 3 basic building blocks of conditional access policy. Ready to go? Okay. Let's talk about target. So there's basically 2 things that we target in our targeting stuff. We target stuff related to users, and we target stuff related to applications. Okay? Users would be just like who's in your Azure AD. And users can be a bunch of interesting stuff too. It's not just members, it can be guests with B2B. I'm not going to really talk about B2B, but they're in there and they can be targeted as part of this ecosystem. Okay? Applications are all of your apps. For most customers, this is going to start off with your Office 365 investment, so it's going to be Outlook and SharePoint and all that kind of stuff, because those are the things that are automatically going to authenticate against your Azure AD. But you also have this whole rich world of SaaS applications that you can integrate with Azure AD, plus you can integrate all of your own applications with Azure AD as well through, go ahead.
Well, I noticed that B2C is missing from this list since we just spent the last hour talking about that. Is that?
That's a good question.
It is not available yet.
Okay.
So just to be clear, because B2C is really a separate entity, they have not implemented that. It's on the feature list. It's requested. I can't give you a date when it will be available.
Got it. Thank you.
Thanks. I wasn't actually sure. I couldn't think of a way that you'd be able to target those users if they're not in your directory. You'll kind of see in a second that would be weird. But yeah, there's some stuff in the B2C app model, especially when you're having like consumer users and your internal users accessing. You can stitch those scenarios together, but there's some stuff to think about. So you have all these enterprise applications. We've been talking about like all this modern auth stuff that you can do with FIDO and whatnot, OpenID Connect, basically modernizing your applications. But as you do this, you can add them here. This is, if you are planning on having a big investment in the Microsoft platform, I would highly recommend that this be where your apps end up. This is, as opposed to like putting them in an ADFS system, which we did a lot of and now have a little bit of buyer's remorse. And I'll tell you a little bit about that later. ADFS is great. We've gotten a ton of mileage out of it, but I have like literally 5,000 configurations in ADFS that I now want to move to the cloud, and that's a really expensive project as it turns out. So, and then you can also take traditional applications with Azure App Proxy, and I'm not going to talk about App Proxy very much. It's a really pretty fascinating technology, but just imagine it's kind of like a Lego block converter where you can take an on-prem Kerberos app that's on your internal network and turn it into a modern auth app that is available on the external network and has all these different kinds of controls like single sign-on and multi-factor authentication and integration with Hello for Business and all this policy magic that we can do on top of it. So it's a really neat technology, definitely something worth looking at in the Azure landscape because it's also remarkably easy to deploy for that kind of magic that it does. Okay. So we're going to look around a little bit. Within our conditional access policies, one of the things that you'll see is that there's usually a way to include people and a way to exclude. And this is actually really, really important. It allows you to craft fairly rich policies. So one of my dear friends, a somewhat legend in the field of identity management named Brian Poole once told me, all identity management is exception management. And he just left that sit right there and was like, wow, Brian, that's really deep. That's super cool. And that's almost certainly the coolest thing I'm going to say all week. But the nice thing here is because there's rich features related to exclusions within your ability to target users, you can do all the exception management you want related to this stuff. And you will find that there are certain things that you want to do. Like, see this guy down here, PIM Firefighter 1? Like when everything is sad and broken, and you need to go to your break glass accounts, you might not want those to require multi-factor authentication, for example, because how are you going to do it? So yeah, if you find that you need this, you might want to make sure that you have those things in place. And I hid some of the names here, but the bottom line is you have rich semantics for doing this. The other thing that's really great about this is that this supports like any group in Azure AD, and it works with nested groups. I don't know how many of you work with Azure AD, but there's always this weird song and dance as to which features in Azure AD work with nested groups and which don't. And this one does, and that makes this feature useful as opposed to all the other features that don't work with nested groups, like licensing and app assignments and Azure app roles, which drive me nuts because we're a big company. We manage all of our groups on-prem, and they're all nested. And so anyway, this works with nesting. It's beautiful. Yep.
What's the philosophy, the current philosophy right now with those firefighting accounts that we sort of accept are, we're not going to,
So
we can't use 2FA.
So this is not an Azure AD disaster recovery talk, but the really quick thing I will say on that is that you want to make sure that you have break glass accounts that are like Azure specific accounts that are not like on-prem federated accounts, because if things go really, really bad and you find that you need those things, you want to make sure that you have them, you know where the passwords are for them, and that you also might want to make sure that they don't require MFA in case you need to use them. These frequently are going to have like GA, a global administrator access in your tenant and stuff like that. But
So we just lock the passwords in a bank vault with armed guards kind of thing, and we live with it?
yeah, or you put it in your desk drawer, like whatever it is that you do. So yeah. So anyway, so let's move on. Targeting applications. I will quickly run out of time if I don't go through the basic stuff here quickly. So we talked about users, targeting applications. So there's essentially what you do is you pick apps from the list of applications that you have configured within Azure AD that you can use to target. There's some new functionality coming out. It's either out or will be out soon, like previewee things related to being able to put apps into groups now, which will help you with the management of these things. But the idea is that you're going to target apps, and you can also do exclusions. As per the caveat there, be careful with selecting all cloud apps. All cloud apps will really apply this policy to everything, and you want to make sure that that you don't cause a dreadful harm by doing these things. We do actually have a policy that targets all cloud apps, though, for MFA in our environment, and it literally forces us to do MFA on everything with those excluded users. Okay? So I think that's probably enough on targeting applications unless there are questions. I'm going to move on to conditions. We good to go to conditions? Yep. Okay, cool. So I'm not going to talk about all the conditions. There's a number of different types of conditions, but I'm going to drill down on a few of these. Sign-on risk is a condition. This is related to, so there's a feature within Azure AD Premium P2 called Azure AD Identity Protection, or it's usually called risk-based authentication. And it's this well, we'll talk about it in a second because I got a slide on it. But that is one of the conditions that you can apply, client device type and location. I'm not going to talk about the other ones, although the device state one is pretty interesting because device state is both it's something that you can use as a condition and also something that you can use as a control. So it's a little bit confusing, but there are actually some really interesting uses you can do with device state as a condition. And if we have time later, maybe we'll come back to that. All right? So we talked about this a little bit, but the basic idea here with risk is that you can essentially so basically what Azure AD is doing with every authentication is evaluating the risk of the authentication based on a bunch of heuristics that are going on. Like it looks at the source IP of where somebody's coming in and like the unusualness of it. And it basically scores every authentication that it sees coming into the platform, and they will get a risk score. And then what you can do is based on the risk at runtime of that authentication that Microsoft has assigned, you can have different policies trigger. Like if this looks like a high risk thing and it's with like the CEO's credentials, maybe you want to force an MFA. Maybe you don't want that to happen at all. So there's a bunch of really interesting things you can do with doing risk-based auth in the platform. This is the feature that you need to step up to P2 to get though, okay? I think that is what that's all I've got for it. But it is a really, really interesting and super rich piece of the platform that I would definitely recommend people to check out and take advantage of. Yes, Miles?
So in terms of how they assess that, do you know how long it takes Azure or approximate amount of time? Like if you enabled it today and Miles starts signing in.
It's actually being assessed always. And you will actually get risk scores in your audit logs. It's just that for you to actually be able to articulate your own policies about what you want to do about it, that's what you're paying for. But it's actually incredibly fast, and it's done on every single authentication.
So it would do something like Miles is, how would it know that I'm a US employee? Like I'm just trying to understand the logic that it's using, because it would have to have some familiarity with me before it could start making decisions about.
Yeah, so it has this really complicated heuristics model. There's like some really interesting talks on how it works and all the various machine learning and stuff that goes into it, and how they're like constantly updating the ML models and how they make it super fast and whatnot. And like the first HIP conference a year and a half ago in New York, someone did like an entire session on this. It's like a really cool technology. I don't have enough time to get into a lot of detail, but it is one of the crown jewels of the platform. It is a really pretty interesting piece of technology in terms of how it works and how it's able to make these policy evaluations at really high speed and using machine learning technologies. So yeah, if you got P2, you should definitely use it. And if you're thinking of a reason to buy P2, this is pretty neat stuff.
With a place like Accenture where people are traveling all the time, do you get false reads when someone is in Beijing?
So first of all, one thing to know is Accenture has not yet bought P2, so we are not actually using this yet. We're admiring this problem. At 500,000 people, all licensing discussions end up being like just crazy amounts of money, and and take us a long time to come around to these things. Since we require multi-factor authentication for everything all the time as well, most of the remedies that you're likely to implement with this stuff would do a step up to MFA anyway. And so from our perspective, we don't necessarily get as much value with this. We are interested with this for things like service accounts that have MFA disabled on them, for example. They generally have much longer passwords, but they're also like an interesting attack surface because they're not being MFA'd. So, okay. Yeah?
I can answer that question.
Oh, sure, go ahead.
Yeah, on the traveling people, the biggest issue you run into is impossible travel with airline Wi-Fi.
Mm-hmm.
So somebody gets on a plane, the airplane picks up wherever location, like Canada or something, and now you can't log in because it's impossible for you to be in San Francisco and Canada within 2 minutes.
Teaching Azure your locations ends up being important to get good results out of any of the location-based awareness stuff as well too. Wait, let's. I get to that in a sec too. So.
Do you override any of the risk scoring?
Darren, we don't have this feature. I haven't used it yet. I have that slide. I need to keep going.
Don't you have to have a user group assigned to all of the different conditional access to where you would just exclude people that you would maybe say they're likely to be?
So, yeah, and so there's like, you have a lot of flexibility with targeting. Like, for example, you could specifically target your executive leadership team for stuff and do interesting things for them that you might ignore for your lesser important people and whatnot. But yeah, okay. Let me talk about device. So this basically, you can target specific devices accessing stuff. And you see the devices that are available here. And you can also do exclusions based on devices as well. And so this is pretty interesting because you can make policies apply only to specific platforms. You'll notice that Linux is missing, as are Chromebooks, which we find slightly annoying. It's not a huge big deal for us, but Chromebooks are actually kind of becoming a little bit more of a big deal for us. But it is possible to block things that can't be detected as a platform. So on the exclude side, you can basically say everything including unsupported, and it will block. It will then apply to Linux even if it doesn't know what it is. Okay, so targeting devices. Let me talk. Is it okay if I keep going? Yeah, like I said, I don't want to run out of time. Location. So location is basically, it gives you the ability to target things based on locations. Azure gives you the ability to, or Azure AD gives you the ability to feed in things like your IP ranges. So like whatever your egress IPs out of your corporate network are onto the public internet, you can feed that data back into Azure AD, for example. And then and you can name these things and use them as trusted locations. And basically, you can then allow Azure AD to treat these things separately. So you could do things like, when my people are on my internal network, they have to do this, but if they're not on my internal network, then they have to do this. So that's what this stuff is based on. And there's a number of different ways you can specify it. You can do it based on IP ranges. You can do it based on countries and regions. That thing marked as trusted location has additional semantics that feed into other parts of the platform, like MFA and whatnot. But it's a powerful mechanism. A lot of people are really, really interested in this, especially like inside-outside semantics. It's something we're starting to care about less because we're trying to move to this model where we don't think of our internal network as being special. And especially, we're trying to think of the data center network as being special, but the office networks as being like a hotbed of contamination and basically just one step above a Starbucks. And I think this is healthy. This is growth, right? But so at the same time, like some of those semantics become less and less interesting. And like I said, we force everyone to MFA all the time anyway. So I don't care if you're on the internal network or not. But I will tell you. So we do. Here's a specific example of something we did do with this though. So we had an app. And we really wanted to MFA the app, and the app was basically using legacy auth, and there was nothing we could do with it. So we're like, okay, we're going to use this app proxy thing. We're going to put the app proxy in front of it, and that's going to allow us to turn it into a modern auth app, and then I can put an MFA policy on it through conditional access. Now it's MFA. Except we also, what happens when you app proxy something is it ends up on the public internet. And they're like, oh, we don't really want this on the public internet. It was on the internal network, and now you put our special thing that we're all scared about on the public internet, and that scares us. And we're like, okay, so we can do this thing whereby we can say, to get to this app, you have to be accessing it from our internal network. And so even though the endpoint is on the public internet now, you cannot actually access it unless you're coming from our internal network. And we've effectively made it an internal facing app from the client perspective, even though it is actually public facing. So this is, I would call this a stupid CA trick, but there's like a lot of really interesting things you can do using the policy language in the framework. Okay? I'm going to jump over to controls. There are more controls than there are conditions, and we are only going to talk about the highlighted ones. But I will just like, I will briefly highlight the ones that we're not going to deep dive into, which are the bolded ones, so you kind of know what they are, and then we'll dive in a little bit deeper on the bold ones. Sound good? Okay, so controls. The most basic thing you can do is allow or block. This is an incredibly rich policy framework, but if you just want to do like a user policy that says block unless it's these guys, you can totally do that. Block unless, except for these users, and you've done a really basic access control list. Those semantics are there. Obviously, there's a whole lot more stuff that you could do, but that is a thing that you can do. Terms of use, like anyone ever having like GDPR or not sure if they have GDPR problems, and their lawyers say, throw up terms of use everywhere just to make sure that we're covered for GDPR. So there's some really powerful functionality within the platform where you can force people to accept a terms of use in order to gain access to something, and the platform will not let them in until they accept your terms of use. You can have multiple terms of use objects created that allow you to basically provide different terms to different types of systems. Like we have like one for Intune, and we have one for MAM, and we have one for this and whatnot. So you can do different stuff with this. There were a bunch of really interesting features that were just dropped around the holidays for terms of use, where you can now make terms of use per device if you need that, and you can make them expire, make people redo them periodically and stuff like that. In any event, it's an interesting thing that makes the lawyers happy, and you should take advantage of it because it's right there. You can force people to reset their password, which is kind of neat. This goes really well with the risk-based sign-in. If Azure detects that your password has been compromised through their heuristic mechanism, if you're doing the password hash sync and whatnot, they will tell you when it finds people whose passwords have been dumped on the public internet, and then you can actually use this to force them to change their password, or you can just do it whenever you want. This is part of risk-based stuff. So. The custom controls, there's some extensibility in the system that you can apply. Like you can use Trusona, for example, to do additional high-end identity proofing, which is kind of neat. You can do session-based auth, which is CAS, which is a whole other topic that I'm not going to talk about. But you can basically say, I want them to go into a special session broker to have their session monitored because of blah-de-blah. And this is how you bootstrap into CAS through conditional access. Okay? And so we are going to talk about these other three things: hybrid Azure AD join, compliant device multi-factor auth. Yes?
You mentioned GDPR. Does this go beyond the GDPR?
So it has nothing to do with GDPR. It is the ability to display a terms of use, which is something that sometimes people will use as part of a strategy around how they attempt to be in compliance with GDPR or any other thing that the lawyers think requires a terms of use to be done. Like a more common example might be, we want you to accept the terms of use to use your personal mobile device to access our Office 365 services. like if you're using MAM or something like that. And I'm not going to get too much into all the mobile stuff and whatnot, but like the lawyers will frequently want you to do these things, and you have like this whole Swiss Army knife toolbox of things that you can do with it. But it's not. It would be incorrect for me to say that it really has anything to do with GDPR, because that's really specifically around implementing a whole set of controls that may or may not have anything to do with terms of use at all. Yep.
Have you looked into custom controls at all? Can you describe what the interfaces look like?
No, not really. I mean, and I know that there's like an extensibility point here as well too that I haven't played with it at all. I have had numerous discussions with the Trusona guys about their passwordless auth and high-end identity proofing. So it's the only thing I really know about at all that plays in this ecosystem. It's kind of neat, and the kind of thing where you might like. One of the things that we were thinking about with it was that maybe we would actually use this for high-end identity proofing for really special targets within the company, like the guys who have access to the bank stuff, like the treasury guys who are always getting phished and whatnot. Maybe there's some stuff we would want to do there. It's the kind of thing that you'd like to do on your executive leadership team that you'd probably get fired if you actually deployed it, because they'd be like, where's my secretary? So in any event, so basically no, I don't have a lot of experience with any of the customization stuff there. Okay, so talking about MFA, if there's any one thing that anyone was to do with conditional access, and anything that anyone is doing in the cloud at all, everyone should just be doing MFA. It's incredibly important. It's so much easier to deploy than it ever was before. And if you're buying P1, you now have MFA. Just use it, deploy it. It's good, and there's a lot of richness in this platform, but requiring a multi-factor authentication is one of the things you can do as a control in any case as part of a conditional access thing. I will talk a tiny little bit about Windows Hello for Business. This is my new favorite thing. Conditional access was my old favorite thing. Now, Windows Hello for Business is my new favorite thing. So this is the last time I will ever talk about conditional access in public. But one of the things that's really cool about Hello for Business is that it is actually treated as an MFA-based authentication when you go against Azure AD. So that sign in to your device that's like magic and fast, it flows all the way up to the cloud and treated directly as MFA by the platform. Okay? So I have a little bit of stuff related to troubleshooting. So there's really a couple of things that you're going to talk about related to troubleshooting. And after this, we're going to do our pivot to the device auth, and we get a little bit nerdier. But there's two basic things you're likely going to be using for doing troubleshooting related to conditional access. So sign-on logs, and this is an example of the sign-on logs. One of the cool things with the sign-on logs is that you don't see this column right here. It shows you which conditional access policies may have been applied to any particular authentication event, and whether or not the conditional access policy allowed the thing through or blocked it. This is incredibly useful for the person who's saying, I can't get in, and you have to try and figure out what happened. You go find them in your logs, look for them, and do it that way. There's also this thing called the what if tool, which allows you to basically do what if scenarios on on your conditional access policies to give you an idea, if you do this, what will happen. So you should definitely use that when you're planning out your stuff to try and make sure that you don't do the thing where you accidentally block the CEO and everyone else in the company from getting into Exchange, which is really, really easy to do. Yeah. Any questions on troubleshooting, and then we're going to start to pivot into device auth. Okay, device state. So this has been something that I've been working on personally for a few years now, and I was talking about that. So we were like, I would say we were kind of the original BYO company, but now as we start to, as the landscape of horrifying devices on the internet becomes more apparent to everyone, and the sacredness of the corporate device and what we at least think we're doing in terms of managing those endpoints becomes important to us. We would very much like to be able to treat the device as a first-class citizen of the policy model. Because just knowing the user's identity and being really certain about that doesn't necessarily mean that we can trust that, because if they're coming from a device that is not trusted, that identity may not be trustworthy, okay? So device state is important. Being able to understand the device state is something that you might want to be able to do. So in any event, just going to talk a little bit about some of our stuff. And I think I hit on a bunch of these things already. But so we're a big company. We've got like about 500,000 users in our directory. We're not as big as those guys over there, but we're pretty big. And it's a pretty interesting place to work as an identity management professional. We hire like a couple thousand people a week in Accenture. So yeah, it's crazy. I was talking, like some of the stuff we were talking about with B2C is related to our former employee directory. We're now at a point where there's been 1 million people who are now former employees of Accenture in the world since we started keeping track. And that's a lot of people who worked for us and have quit. So in any event, and I'm not one of them yet. Okay, so we have lots and lots and lots of public-facing web apps. Our normal deployment model for what we would call an application in Accenture is a browser-based web application that's on the public internet. This is our bread and butter, what we do all the time. And we do this in the cloud, we do this on-prem, but like we have like a crazy amount of public IP space, and we use a lot through Amazon and Azure and whatnot. And this is our normal deployment model. So all of our apps look like SaaS apps, so we have actually our big things have been like MFAing the entire company. So we have the entire everyone in Accenture is MFA'd, like 500,000 people, and we have MFA applied to thousands of applications, including the entire Office 365 suite. So it's a pretty cool story. We've also hybrid domain joined our entire fleet of 500,000 workstations successfully, and we're applying the policy that says if you're going to use the Outlook desktop client, you have to be on a hybrid domain joined device, which if you can think about the ops around that is pretty interesting, because like if you have like a 0.1% failure rate, you've got like thousands of failures, and it's just been pretty solid for us so far. Yep.
How long has Semantic Vip been supported by Azure as a MFA solution? Okay, so we do something complicated here. I think I have a slide on this. I can't remember where, so maybe we'll get to it. Well, I'll just explain it now. So what we do actually is, like a lot of big customers, all of the Azure AD users with like Accenture.com UPN suffixes are federated. They go back to on-prem ADFS. And there's another feature within your Azure AD federation configuration that you can flag a specific federation configuration as supporting MFA. And so what happens then is that anytime Azure wants to MFA something, it'll just say, oh, I'm not going to MFA them. I'm going to send them back to on-prem. And so we actually have Semantic Vip integrated with ADFS on-prem, and we actually wrote our own like ADFS MFA plugin for it. They have one, but we wrote ours first, and we like it better, so we just use our own. We're actually in the process of dumping this and moving on to, is Semantic in the room? Being already a paying customer for Azure MFA, it no longer makes financial sense for Accenture to invest in 2 MFA platforms. And we'll consolidate on the one that we can't get out of, which is part of our EMS3 license. So yes, but the good thing with our architecture is that this is actually doable. If I can re-register my users in Azure MFA, MFA only exists really in 2 spots. It's in that one thing on ADFS and in the cloud, and I can kind of flip everyone over, which is neat. Okay. But yeah, I won't talk about semantic, the other things you can do with semantic because we use it in a relatively specific way. But we do have a pretty giant deployment of it.
Well, just asking because we use semantic also, and when we first were moving into Azure, it was, oh no, can't use semantic here. So.
Oh, you totally can if you do this.
Right, well that's
Yeah.
okay, but not natively in Azure.
Right,
But
right.
Recently, yeah, they did just recently.
Yeah, I think there is native support now, and yeah, we would never use that. Our goal is to continue to use the thing we have until we migrate off, and yeah, and that should be soon. We're working hard on that right now. Okay, so let's do the device auth deep dive. First of all, in order for devices to be authenticated, which is how you actually know who they are and can make interesting decisions about them, they all have to get registered. So there's a number of different ways that things can get registered. Let me just kind of run through this real quick. By the way, who's messing around with this stuff? Who's doing like hybrid join with Windows 10 or even with Windows 7 or like using Intune, registering devices that way? I'm just, anyone? Like, everything but Windows 7. It actually works. You can totally do that. Anyone doing like Azure AD join, like modern management? Cool. All right. We're not yet. We're admiring modern management, but not really quite there yet. Okay. So anyway, this is how stuff gets registered basically. With Windows 10, you have. It's GPO based, and your machines will basically automatically register themselves. Or you can do Azure AD join, or you can do add worker school account, which I recommend you avoid because you cannot get compliance through that. And then there's some other stuff you can do with your down level stuff, and then mobile is Intune, and Mac is Intune through Jamf. Any Mac Jamf people? Yeah.
Just know
That-
you're gonna need Jamf.
You will need Jamf, and it's,
Painful.
yeah, I don't know what else to say.
They'll tell you they have a 98% success rate with integrating with Azure.
Sure, that sounds reasonable. Yeah, there's Mr. Endez over there. So in any event, if you're doing Azure AD join and you were wondering where the settings are that control this stuff, there's actually not a giant amount of surface area. By the way, these are not like the recommended settings. These are just settings. These are just where the settings are. Do not take anything that you see checked or unchecked here as what you should be doing. This is not prescriptive guidance. This is just literally where the settings are. So under devices in your Azure AD, go to device settings, and so this stuff over here will control like device registration stuff for the Azure AD join use case. Do people understand the difference between hybrid join, Azure AD join, and worker school account? Should I explain that real quick? Okay, let me try and explain that real quick. So hybrid join is for machines that are domain joined. You probably mostly have domain joined machines. And what happens in hybrid join is that the devices will register themselves in Azure AD with some software that's built into Windows 10, and based on some configuration that you put in your tenant. It's generally managed through Azure AD Connect, which you're probably also running. And essentially all of the machines will end up with device objects that get created in Azure AD that allow them to authenticate to the system, okay? And it's generally done silently. So there's like a GPO, it's on by default. And if you have the rest of the plumbing in place, so you've gone through the Azure AD Connect stuff to turn it on, it should really just work. And your machines will all register themselves. And they will end up with a device object in the cloud, and you'll be able to look at it and you'll be able to tell them apart from people who did like just add worker school account. And add worker school account is when you click on the box in Windows 10 and do add worker school account, which is not something I would recommend you do a whole lot of in the corporate world, but it has uses on personal machines and whatnot. So Azure AD Join is the pure modern management version. So basically in Azure AD Join, your machine is not actually joined to an Active Directory forest. It is joined to Azure Active Directory. You're logging in with an org ID onto the machine, and you're using pure modern management. amazingly, there's like all this plumbing that allows everything to work. Like Windows Hello for Business can actually be configured on these things, and you can actually get curb login to AD resources and whatnot. But the pure modern management use case for people who are either interested in moving off of the dependency on on-prem directory and having like computer accounts to the pure modern management thing is Azure AD Join. Or like all the new companies like, why would I ever deploy an Active Directory? That would be crazy. This is how you do it. So, so those are your three basic things. That like device management is a whole giant topic, and I probably can't really get into it a whole lot more than that, but those are your three options for Windows 10, basically. And 8.1 and 7 are basically hybrid or worker school account. There is no Azure AD Join for down level. Okay? Is that okay? There's a little bit of stuff about what happens when things are registered. So in hybrid, I'm not going to drain all this, but essentially there's like some step-by-step stuff here that shows you what happens. And eventually, the machine's going to get a certificate. Certificates are like part of the plumbing of everything. They were part of the plumbing of all of the stuff that that we were talking about with FIDO and whatnot. And the public key, private key stuff is everywhere. With the manual stuff, you essentially go through a flow where the user is doing something interactive, but will eventually end up getting a certificate with the public key known to Azure AD, so it can authenticate with it later. Okay. Typically, the certificate is going to be protected by the TPM on the machine as well. So it's actually like a good, strong credential protection. So this is actually just a screenshot right out of our thing that shows a giant mix of stuff that's in our environment. And you will see that, like if you're looking at your device's dashboard within Azure AD, you'll see all the stuff out there. So we've got like a giant mix of things. There's hybrid Azure AD Join stuff. There are Android machines that are registered. Somebody just added their work or school account. For something, there's stuff that's set up with Intune. If things are managed with Intune, you will also see your compliance state. And we're going to talk about compliance in a sec, because compliance is interesting. This is what the view of an ecosystem of devices that has a bunch of different stuff going on. Do I have a Mac example in there? I don't think I captured a page with a Mac example. I got an iPhone and Android, but okay. Talked about this a little bit. Okay, so let me just talk about this big blob of stuff over here. At a certain point in your Azure AD explorations, you may get to the point where you need to look at the Graph API. Like anyone who's ever felt like they needed to look at raw LDAP stuff, this is for you, because this is where the stuff is. And I would highly recommend anyone who wants to be a very strong administrator or developer of this platform to gain a little bit of familiarity with Graph API. It's really pretty interesting, rich semantically. A lot of it is actually pretty LDAP-y, except that like it's all kind of JSON and OData and whatnot. But this is an actual dump of a device object out of Azure AD from the Graph API perspective. So, and you can see some stuff in here. One of the things that you'll see is that this particular device object has no compliance state, but it's managed. And this is an indication that it's a hybrid join machine. You also see a bunch of stuff related to the metadata around Azure AD Connect. So really great advanced troubleshooting stuff. Alan actually had a link to how you get to the Graph API, but I would definitely recommend spending a little bit of time poking around in there and just looking at stuff, because it's where all the dirty details are. Let me keep going, because we're going to run out of time. So let me talk. Okay, so I talked about device compliance. So we have a good pivot here. So basically, when you're doing conditional access policies, there's really kind of two device-related things you can do. So you can say the device is hybrid Azure AD join, which basically means it's just a domain join machine. Okay. You can also say the device is compliant, and and compliance is something that is maintained by Intune. And you can actually do either ors on these things, but but basically compliance is an Intune thing, and it's basically if Intune says that the device is compliant, it will be marked in the directory as being compliant, and then any policy enforcement that is done that requires compliance will look at that state after the device is authenticated and make a decision as to whether or not it's compliant. So it's basically your Intune compliance policies, however those were applied and last polled and stored in the directory are dictating how that works. And so we talked a little bit about registration. So Intune's a big piece of this. Anyone looking at like Intune and co-management for their hybrid, that just us? So if you want to use Intune to do compliance-related stuff in the cloud for your Windows machines, then you end up having to look at either modern management or co-management, where you're basically installing Intune on all of your machines in addition to your SCCM client. So a lot of you may end up in that journey if you want to be able to use these levers on your Windows machines. And this is how you would already be doing your MDM stuff. Like for example, an MDM managed mobile device that is compliant with Intune will show up in Azure AD as being compliant. So when that device authenticates, and if you require a compliant device for whatever thing they were accessing, it will work. If they're no longer compliant, as of whenever like the polling frequency came through, they will get blocked. And it's an important, useful thing to the extent that you're getting good compliance information around Intune. This is how it all loops back in and gets enforced. Okay, and this is real. This is a for certain thing that happens. Device authentication. So there is some like crazy magical weird stuff in Windows 10 for device-based authentication that works differently than everything else. With everything else, we're basically using client certificates. There's some special magic that gets added into some of the stuff in the mobile stack, but mostly we're doing client certificates and client TLS. In Windows 10, there's this thing called the token broker and the web authentication manager. So there's a bunch of specific plumbing within Windows 10 that allows devices to authenticate directly to the platform. And there's this notion of this thing called a primary refresh token, or a PRT. This is lingo that gets bounced around quite a bit. A PRT is really, really similar to a curb TGT in terms of the function that it serves in the ecosystem. But the main thing to know is that Windows 10 is different, and there's a bunch of special plumbing within Windows 10 to make all this stuff work. And Windows Hello for Business piggybacks on top of it as well too. Yeah, possibly could do an entire talk on that. But in any event, the main takeaway there is Windows 10 is special and has all this extra stuff in it. Yes?
So it's called a primary refresh token, but is there a secondary refresh token?
So it's more like the token that is used to get other tokens. So there will be you will potentially have other tokens that are used to get another refresh token. Like for example, the primary refresh token might be used to get a refresh token for Outlook against Exchange, and then your Outlook client will have a refresh token that's Exchange specific that it then uses to get access tokens, doing like the OAuth thing. And your machines are doing this all the time and you don't really even know it, but like that whole bootstrapping thing where you're hopefully not getting asked for CRUDs all the time, it would be because you have this primary refresh token. Did that explain a little bit better? Okay. I think that I'm nearly out of time, so I'm going to start skipping ahead a little bit. Very quickly, related to device authentication, there's some neato customization stuff that nobody knows about that you can do. One of the things that when we block people from getting to applications because there's something wrong with their device auth, The error tends to be a little bit mysterious, and we really, really wanted to have an ability to tell people in some Accenture-specific way that your stuff is not working and here's how you get out of jail. So there's some customization endpoints that are available in here where you can create your own web UI for specific types of errors within conditional access that you can take advantage of if you want to. So you can also, if you're doing ADFS, you can do device auth on-prem. So if you hybrid register your machines, you get these device objects in the cloud. If you're running Azure AD Connect, those device objects can actually be synced back to on-prem with what's called Azure AD write-back, which is something that Connect will do. You'll basically end up with a bunch of device objects in a special container within Active Directory, and then ADFS will then be able to reason over them. The state will be mastered out of Azure AD, so like the compliance state changes in Azure AD through Intune, it will write back to on-prem. But you can then actually use device auth on-prem against ADFS with the platform if you have all this stuff enabled. Okay? My new favorite thing, I wish we had time to talk about this. I wish I was doing a talk on Windows Hello for Business, but next time we'll talk about Windows Hello for Business. It's such a beautiful thing. It has like a bunch of crazy warts on it that make it somewhat difficult and challenging to deploy, but it is a really, really cool thing. So next time we'll talk about it. But yeah, it's MFA without passwords, and it is a great technology and definitely something I would encourage people to start looking at within their enterprises. And it works in the entire ecosystem really, really cleanly. So some trouble. The one thing I will say, troubleshooting device registration on Windows 10, there is a command called dsregcmd.exe/status that one will run from time to time and look at things, and it has output that looks like this. And this stuff is incredibly useful for understanding the state of any given device and knowing whether it's working correctly or not. You'll notice here, my user state, I have an Azure AD PRT, but I do not have an enterprise PRT. This would be really helpful to know because this machine would never enroll for Windows Hello for Business if it doesn't have an enterprise PRT. And these are the kinds of things that you, as an IT professional who might be deploying this stuff, might need to know and want to know how to troubleshoot. So this, the logs, there's a bunch of device state-specific stuff that actually has pretty decent plumbing. And I'm basically out of time. I'm going to leave 2 minutes for additional questions. Hopefully this was interesting and useful to you guys, and you got like a decent overview of conditional access, and then we jumped in the deep end with the device-based conditional access. But anyone have any questions? Clearly, the conditional access stuff is very much aimed at modern authentication use cases. Like I said, this stuff does bleed over into on-prem, not necessarily from a conditional access perspective, unless you're using App Proxy. App Proxy is this great connector to on-prem stuff. So you can take all your Kerberos apps and turn them into modern auth apps, and then start applying these policies and these controls to them. And you don't have to completely modernize your entire fleet of applications in order to take advantage of that stuff. Windows Hello for Business is pretty cool. It does Kerberos-based login without passwords. It's like being able to deploy smart cards to an entire organization without actually ever having to have a smart card. So cool stuff. Anyone else?
So it's not specifically related to Azure AD conditional access, but they have started down the path of putting some conditional access capabilities into on-prem AD.
Mm-hmm.
Just pretty much abandon that. Is there any integration with this?
So there's capability within ADFS in that you can do authorization policies within ADFS, and the state related to the devices is available if you're doing that write-back stuff, like I was saying. So there is some capability there. I think the writing is on the wall for additional investment on-prem AD. I mean, did anyone notice that there's not even a force functional level change in 2019 AD? Yeah, that's all you need to know about on-prem AD. But in any event, I am out of time, guys. Thank you very much. I appreciate it. And yeah, I hope you got something out of the talk.